The phone rang at 11:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning that started with me carefully arranging white lilies in crystal vases, but ended with me discovering that grief can make you do things you never thought possible. I was in my dining room, surrounded by photo albums, memorial programs, and tissue boxes, preparing for James's celebration of life service that was scheduled for the following Saturday. It had been 3 weeks since my husband of 22 years lost his battle with pancreatic cancer, and I was finally ready to give him the beautiful farewell he deserved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Our son Tyler was away at college, trying to balance his grief with his senior year coursework, while our daughter Madison had taken a leave from her job in Seattle to help me through the planning process. The house felt impossibly quiet without James's gentle humming or the sound of his morning coffee ritual, but I was slowly learning to navigate this new reality of widowhood at 51. When I answered the phone that morning, I expected to hear from the caterer confirming the menu details, or perhaps Father Martinez calling about the final arrangements for the church service. Instead, I found myself speaking with a woman whose voice I didn't recognize, though she seemed to know exactly who I was. Mrs. Patricia Coleman, this is Jennifer Walsh from Serenity Memorial Services. I'm calling regarding your husband James Coleman's arrangements. I'm sorry, but I think there's been some confusion. I already spoke with Mr. Davidson about everything last week. Our service is this Saturday, and I was told everything was finalized. There was a pause on the other end that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Mrs. Coleman, I'm afraid I'm not calling about your service arrangements. I'm calling because there's been a significant problem with your husband's cremation remains. A problem? What kind of problem? Jennifer's voice became carefully professional, the kind of tone people use when they're about to deliver devastating news. Mrs. Coleman, I work for the State Crematory Oversight Board. We've been investigating irregularities at Davidson & Sons Funeral Home, and I'm afraid your husband's ashes are no longer in their possession. The photo album I'd been holding slipped from my hands and scattered pictures across the hardwood floor. Pictures of James and me on our honeymoon in Cabo, James teaching Tyler to ride a bike, James walking Madison down the aisle at her college graduation ceremony. What do you mean they're no longer in their possession? Mrs. Coleman, I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that we're doing everything possible to resolve the situation. When did you last have contact with Davidson & Sons regarding your husband's remains? I spoke with Robert Davidson 3 days ago to confirm the details for Saturday's service. He assured me that James's ashes would be delivered to the church by Friday afternoon in the mahogany urn I selected. I see. Mrs. Coleman, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but according to our investigation, your husband's cremated remains were sold to a private collector 6 days ago. The words didn't compute at first. I sat down heavily on my dining room chair, staring at the memorial programs I'd spent hours designing with James's favorite Bible verse printed in elegant script. I'm sorry, but that's impossible. James's ashes are at the funeral home. I've been planning his memorial service. We have over 100 people coming on Saturday. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. Jennifer's voice softened with what sounded like genuine sympathy. Mrs. Coleman, Robert Davidson has been operating an illegal side business selling cremated remains to collectors and artists who use human ash in pottery and jewelry. Your husband's remains, along with those of at least 12 other individuals, were sold without family consent. The room started spinning around me. I gripped the edge of my dining table so hard my knuckles turned white. Madison, who had been upstairs wrapping flowers for the altar arrangements, must have heard something in my voice because she came rushing down the stairs with concern written across her face. This has to be some kind of mistake. Robert Davidson is a respected member of our community. His family has been running that funeral home for 3 generations. My husband trusted him. I trusted him. Mrs. Coleman, I understand how difficult this is to process. We've been investigating Davidson & Sons for 2 months after receiving an anonymous tip. Yesterday, we executed a search warrant and found extensive records of these illegal sales, including documentation of your husband's remains being sold to a ceramic artist in Portland for $800. $800. 22 years of marriage, reduced to $800 in someone's bank account. I could hear Madison asking what was wrong, but her voice seemed to be coming from very far away. My mouth moved, but no sound came out. I kept thinking about the mahogany urn I'd selected, the one with a brass nameplate that read James Michael Coleman, beloved husband and father. The urn that was apparently empty. "Mrs. Coleman, are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered. "I'm here. Where are my husband's ashes now?" "We're working with Portland police to recover the remains, but the ceramic artist claims she's already incorporated some of the ash into several pieces that have been sold to private buyers. We may be able to recover a portion, but I need to be honest with you, the full amount may not be recoverable." I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence while Madison knelt beside my chair, asking question after question that I couldn't answer. "How do you explain to your daughter that her father's remains have been scattered to strangers who turned him into pottery? How do you process the fact that while you were carefully selecting flowers and writing eulogy notes, someone was treating your husband's body like a commodity to be sold?" The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and legal consultations. I called our family attorney, David Chen, who immediately put me in touch with a specialist in funeral fraud cases. I called Father Martinez to explain why Saturday's service might need to be postponed. I called Tyler at Northwestern University and had to repeat the story 3 times before he understood what I was telling him. But the most difficult call was the one I made to Robert Davidson himself. When his secretary put me through to his office, he answered in the same warm, comforting voice he'd used when walking me through James's arrangements 3 weeks earlier. "Patricia, how are you holding up? I was just thinking about you and wondering if you needed any last-minute assistance with Saturday's service." "Mr. Davidson, I just received a call from the State Oversight Board. They tell me you sold my husband's ashes to someone in Portland." There was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, when Robert finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, defensive, stripped of the professional sympathy I'd grown accustomed to. "Patricia, I think there's been some misunderstanding. I can explain everything." "Explain what, exactly?" "Explain how you sold my husband's body for $800 while I was planning his memorial service. Explain how you looked me in the eye 3 days ago and promised me his ashes would be delivered to the church." The anger in my voice surprised even me. I'd been numb for 3 weeks, moving through grief in a fog of sadness and exhaustion. But this betrayal ignited something I didn't know I had left in me. "Look, Patricia, you have to understand. The funeral business is struggling. People are choosing cremation over traditional burial, and the profit margins are razor thin. When this collector reached out, offering good money for quality ash, I thought I was solving multiple problems. Your husband's remains are still being treated with respect, just in a different form." "Different form?" "Mr. Davidson, my husband is not art supplies. He's not a product to be sold to the highest bidder. He was a high school principal who spent 30 years shaping young minds. He was a father who coached Little League and taught Sunday school. He was my partner who held my hand through chemotherapy when I had breast cancer 5 years ago." Robert's voice became pleading, desperate. "Patricia, please. This can all be worked out. I can offer you a substantial reduction in your final bill. I can provide a replacement urn with comparable ash, so your service can proceed as planned. No one has to know the difference." The suggestion that I might accept substitute ashes like exchanging a defective appliance made my blood run cold. "Mr. Davidson, I want my husband back. All of him. And I want to know exactly who bought him from you. I'm hanging up now, and the next time we speak, it will be in court." After ending the call, I walked upstairs to the bedroom James and I had shared for over 2 decades. His clothes still hung in the closet, his books still sat on the nightstand, his reading glasses still rested on the dresser where he'd left them the night before his final trip to the hospital. I picked up his favorite sweater, the navy blue cardigan with the worn elbows that I'd threatened to throw away a dozen times, and breathed in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the fabric. Madison found me there 20 minutes later, clutching that sweater and crying harder than I had since the day James died. But these weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of rage, betrayal, and a determination I hadn't felt in years. Someone had stolen the last piece of my husband from me, and I was going to get him back. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about Robert Davidson and his funeral home. Attorney Sandra Kellerman from the Funeral Fraud Division had news that made my stomach drop to the floor. "Mrs. Coleman, we've uncovered more than we initially disclosed. The Portland ceramic artist is just one buyer. Your husband's remains were divided and sold to at least 4 different purchasers across 3 states. I sat in James's home office, surrounded by his teaching awards and photos of former students, trying to process what Sandra was telling me. 4 different purchasers meant James had been scattered to people I would never meet, incorporated into objects I would never see, treated like inventory in some macabre marketplace I didn't even know existed. The first buyer was indeed the ceramic artist in Portland, a woman named Angela Morrison, who specialized in memorial pottery. She'd purchased 3 ounces of ash for her latest collection of urns, that she marketed as containing the essence of lost souls. The second buyer was a jewelry maker in Denver, who created pendants and rings using cremated remains mixed with resin. He'd bought 2 ounces for a custom order from a client who collected death-related artifacts. But it was the third and fourth buyers that made me physically ill. A taxidermy artist in rural Montana had purchased 4 ounces to use in preserving pet remains, claiming that human ash added spiritual significance to his work. The final buyer was an art dealer in New York, who specialized in macabre collectibles for wealthy clients who wanted conversation pieces that would shock their dinner guests. Sandra's voice remained steady and professional as she delivered each horrifying detail, but I could hear the disgust underlying her words. Mrs. Coleman, I want you to know that what Robert Davidson did is not just ethically reprehensible, it's a felony in Connecticut. We're talking about desecration of human remains, fraud, and violation of funeral service regulations. He's facing serious prison time. Prison time felt like cold comfort when my husband was scattered across the country in the hands of strangers who saw him as nothing more than an artistic medium. How much of him is recoverable? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. That's where things get complicated. The ceramic artist claims she's already fired several pieces containing your husband's ash, which means those portions are now permanently altered. The jewelry maker has completed 3 custom pieces that he's shipped to clients whose identities he's refusing to disclose, citing customer privacy. The taxidermy artist says he's used the ash in multiple pet preservation projects, and the New York dealer claims he's sold his portion to a private collector who wishes to remain anonymous. I hung up the phone and walked to James's dresser, where I kept the small wooden box containing his wedding ring, his watch, and the leather bookmark he'd used for 30 years. These few physical objects were all I had left of a man who had filled every corner of my life for over 2 decades. Now I was learning that pieces of him were sitting in strangers' homes, incorporated into jewelry and pottery and God knows what else, while I was left with empty hands and an emptier heart. Madison found me there an hour later, still holding James's wedding ring and staring at our wedding photo on the nightstand. Mom, Tyler's driving up from school. He'll be here tonight. We need to figure out what we're telling people about Saturday's service. The memorial service. In all the chaos of discovering James's theft, I'd barely thought about the 130 people who were expecting to gather at St. Matthew's Church to celebrate his life. His former colleagues from Roosevelt High School, his tennis buddies from the country club, neighbors who'd watched him plant the same rose bushes every spring for 15 years. How do you tell people that the guest of honor has been sold to art collectors? I spent the next 3 days making the most difficult phone calls of my life. Each conversation followed the same painful pattern. Explaining that there had been a problem with the funeral home, that James's ashes were not available for the service, that we were postponing indefinitely while legal issues were resolved. Some people were understanding, offering condolences and support. Others pressed for details that I couldn't bear to provide. A few seemed skeptical, as if they suspected I was having some kind of breakdown. The worst conversation was with James's sister Helen, who drove up from Philadelphia specifically for the service. She sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee from the mug James had given her last Christmas, while I tried to explain why her brother's memorial had been canceled. Patricia, this doesn't make sense. You're telling me that Robert Davidson, whose father buried our parents, whose grandfather buried our grandparents, stole Jimmy's ashes and sold them to strangers. Helen's voice carried the same disbelief I'd felt when Jennifer first called me. I showed her the legal documents Sandra had provided, the police reports, the evidence that made it impossible to deny. Helen read through everything twice before setting the papers down with shaking hands. My God, Patricia, what kind of monster does something like this? That question haunted me as I tried to sleep that night. What kind of person looks at a grieving widow and lies directly to her face? What kind of person sees human remains as a business opportunity? I'd known Robert Davidson for years. He'd been genuinely kind when my mother passed away 8 years ago. He'd sent a sympathy card when James was first diagnosed with cancer. He'd seemed authentic in his condolences when James died. But authenticity, I was learning, was surprisingly easy to fake when money was involved. Tyler arrived home that evening, looking older than his 21 years, and carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to process unthinkable news. He'd driven straight through from Illinois, surviving on gas station coffee and the kind of determination that reminded me painfully of his father. We sat in the living room where James used to grade papers and watch the evening news, and I told Tyler everything. About the phone call from Jennifer, about the 4 different buyers, about the legal case that was building against Davidson and Sons. Tyler listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each new detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Finally, he looked up at me with James's eyes and James's stubborn expression. Mom, we're getting Dad back. All of him. I don't care what it takes or how long it takes. Those people don't get to keep pieces of my father. The determination in his voice sparked something in me that I'd thought had died along with James. Tyler was right. This wasn't just about legal justice or monetary compensation. This was about bringing James home, about reclaiming what had been stolen from our family by someone who had betrayed our trust in the most fundamental way possible. That night, I made a decision that would have shocked the woman I'd been a week earlier. I called Sandra Kellerman at home and told her I wanted to pursue every legal avenue available, regardless of cost or time. I wanted criminal charges filed against Robert Davidson. I wanted civil suits filed against every person who had purchased my husband's remains. I wanted investigators tracking down every piece of ash and every object that contained him. Sandra was quiet for a moment before responding. Mrs. Coleman, I need to be honest with you about what this means. This kind of comprehensive legal action could take years to resolve. It's going to be expensive, emotionally draining, and publicly humiliating for everyone involved. Some of these buyers may be genuinely sympathetic people who had no idea they were purchasing stolen remains, and they're going to fight to keep what they've bought. I understand, I told her, but my husband spent his entire career fighting for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it was unpopular. He wouldn't want me to just accept this and move on. He'd want me to make sure it never happens to another family. The next morning brought a surprise visitor that I wasn't prepared for. Robert Davidson himself stood on my front porch at 8:30, looking haggard and desperate in a way that was dramatically different from the composed funeral director I'd known for years. He was unshaven, his usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, and his eyes held the kind of panic that comes from watching your entire life collapse around you. Patricia, please. I need you to hear me out. Just give me 5 minutes to explain before you decide to destroy everything I've worked for. His voice carried a pleading quality that might have moved me a week earlier, but now it just made me angry. Mr. Davidson, you sold my husband to strangers while I was planning his funeral. You looked me in the eye and lied to me repeatedly. You've turned my grief into a legal nightmare and scattered my family's closure across the country. What could you possibly say that would make any of this acceptable? He stepped closer to the door and I noticed his hands were shaking. Patricia, I never meant for it to go this far. It started small, just a few unclaimed remains that had been sitting in storage for years. People who died without family, whose ashes nobody wanted. I thought I was just clearing out old inventory. But James wasn't unclaimed inventory. James had a family who loved him and was planning his memorial service. James had a wife who spent hours selecting the perfect urn and writing his eulogy. Robert's voice broke slightly. I know that, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But Patricia, if you pursue this legal action, you're not just going after me. You're going after my employees, my family, the legacy my grandfather built. 43 people work for Davidson and Sons. 43 families who depend on that business. The manipulation in his words was so transparent it made me feel sick. You should have thought about those 43 families before you started stealing from the dead, I told him. You should have considered your grandfather's legacy before you turned his funeral home into a black market operation. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cashier's check. Patricia, this is for $50,000. It's everything I can liquidate from my personal accounts. Take it as compensation for your pain, and let's settle this quietly. I'll personally oversee getting back whatever remains can be recovered, and I'll provide you with the most beautiful memorial service you've ever seen. I stared at the check, at this man who thought my husband's desecrated remains were worth $50,000 and a promise to do better. The anger that had been building for days finally erupted. Get off my property, I said quietly. And if you ever contact me or my family again, I'll have you arrested for harassment on top of everything else. As Robert Davidson walked back to his car, I realized that the woman who had answered her door to Catherine 3 weeks earlier would have been tempted by that check, would have considered the easier path of quiet settlement. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone who had learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible to win. 3 weeks after Robert Davidson's pathetic attempt at bribery, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Angela Morrison, the ceramic artist in Portland who had purchased James's ashes, and asked if I could drive out to meet her in person. Sandra Kellerman thought I was making a mistake, that direct contact with the buyers could complicate our legal strategy. But I needed to look these people in the eye and understand how they could participate in something so fundamentally wrong. The drive to Portland took me through landscapes James and I had planned to explore together after his retirement. Rolling hills covered in Douglas firs, small towns with antique shops and roadside diners, the kind of scenic route we'd talked about taking in the RV we'd never gotten to buy. I drove with his favorite classical music playing, trying to imagine him in the passenger seat, offering directions and commentary like he used to do on our weekend trips to visit Tyler at college. Angela Morrison's studio sat in a converted warehouse in Portland's industrial district, surrounded by other artists' workshops and galleries. When I called from the parking lot, she agreed to meet with me, though her voice carried obvious nervousness about the confrontation she knew was coming. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her mid-30s, with paint-stained fingers and the kind of earnest expression that belonged to someone who genuinely believed art could heal the world. Her studio was filled with beautiful pottery, elegant urns and vases that would have looked perfect in any upscale home. Under different circumstances, I might have admired her work. Mrs. Coleman, I want you to know how sorry I am, she said before I'd even fully entered her workspace. When Mr. Davidson contacted me about purchasing cremated remains, he told me they were from unclaimed individuals who had died without family. He said it was a way of honoring forgotten people by incorporating them into lasting art. I walked slowly around her studio, looking at the various pieces that might contain traces of my husband. How many people have you bought from Robert Davidson over the past year? Angela's face flushed with what appeared to be genuine shame. About 15 transactions. Maybe 40 or 50 individuals total. He said there was a growing problem with unclaimed remains taking up space in funeral homes, and that artistic incorporation was becoming a recognized alternative to mass burial in Potter's Fields. The calculated nature of Davidson's operation was becoming clearer with each conversation. This wasn't a desperate man making a few bad decisions. This was a systematic business model built on the desecration of the dead and the exploitation of trusting artists and collectors. I need to know exactly which pieces contain my husband's ashes, I told Angela, and I need to know if any of them have been sold. She led me to a corner of the studio where several urns sat on a wooden shelf, each tagged with dates and reference numbers that corresponded to Davidson's sales records. 3 pieces contained James's remains. One was a large decorative urn with intricate blue glazing that she'd completed but not yet fired. One was a smaller vessel that she'd already fired but hadn't sold. The third was a memorial vase that she'd finished 2 days earlier and was planning to include in a gallery showing the following month. Looking at these objects that contained pieces of the man I'd loved for over 2 decades was surreal and heartbreaking. James had been reduced to artistic material, his remains mixed with clay and glazes to create objects that strangers would purchase to decorate their homes. The violation felt fresh and raw, as if I was losing him all over again. Angela watched my face as I studied the pieces containing my husband. Mrs. Coleman, I'll give them all back to you. Right now, today. I don't want any compensation. I don't want to complicate your legal case. I just want to make this right. Her offer caught me off guard. I'd expected defensiveness, maybe even hostility from someone whose livelihood depended on the materials Davidson had been selling her. Instead, I found a young woman who seemed genuinely horrified by her unwitting participation in my family's nightmare. What about your other pieces? The ones made with remains from other families who probably don't even know their loved ones were sold? Angela was quiet for a long moment, staring at the shelf of urns that represented months of work and thousands of dollars in materials and time. I've been thinking about that since the police called me last week. Mrs. Coleman, I think I need to get out of this business entirely. Even if other families never find out what happened, I'll know. I'll always know that my art was built on someone else's grief. That conversation changed something fundamental in how I approached the entire situation. Angela Morrison wasn't a villain who had deliberately participated in desecrating the dead. She was another victim of Robert Davidson's lies, someone whose genuine desire to create meaningful art had been corrupted by his greed and deception. When I returned home with 3 pottery pieces containing James's ashes, I called Sandra Kellerman with a new proposal. I wanted to pursue criminal charges against Davidson with the full force of the law, but I wanted to offer immunity to the buyers who cooperated with our investigation and returned any remains they possessed. Sandra was skeptical. Patricia, some of these buyers paid thousands of dollars for these materials. They're not going to just hand them over without compensation. Then we'll compensate them, I said. Not because they deserve it, but because getting James back is more important than punishing people who were deceived, the same way I was. The next 6 months became a complex dance of legal negotiations, private investigations, and personal confrontations that tested every limit of my emotional endurance. The jewelry maker in Denver initially refused to cooperate, claiming his client's privacy was more important than returning stolen remains. It took a court order and the threat of criminal charges to force him to disclose his buyers' identities. The taxidermy artist in Montana was more cooperative, but the practical challenges of separating human ash from the pet preservation projects where he'd used it proved nearly impossible. In the end, we recovered only a small portion of what he'd purchased. The most difficult case was the New York art dealer, who claimed he'd sold James's ashes to a private collector who had already incorporated them into a custom sculpture. When we finally tracked down the collector, a wealthy Manhattan socialite who specialized in macabre art, she offered to sell the sculpture back to me for $25,000. The gall of demanding payment for my own husband's remains nearly broke me. Tyler, who had taken a semester off school to help with the legal battle, wanted to drive to New York and confront the woman directly. Madison flew in from Seattle every weekend to provide support and help coordinate with our growing team of attorneys and investigators. But it was James's sister Helen who provided the perspective that ultimately guided my decision about the sculpture. She visited one evening while I was agonizing over whether to pay the collector's ransom or pursue more legal action that could drag on for years. Patricia, Helen said as we sat in James's study surrounded by case files and legal documents, my brother was the most practical man I ever knew. He would have hated seeing you spend your retirement savings and your children's college funds on a legal battle that might never end. But he also would have been proud of you for fighting as hard as you have. She was right, of course. James had always been pragmatic above all else, someone who focused on achievable solutions rather than perfect justice. The woman I'd been before his death and theft would have paid the $25,000 just to end the nightmare. But the woman I'd become through this ordeal understood that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. I chose a middle path that James would have appreciated. I paid the New York collector $15,000 for the sculpture, but I also provided all of our evidence about her knowing purchase of stolen remains to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She kept her money, but she also earned a criminal investigation that would follow her for years. By the time the legal dust settled, I had recovered approximately 60% of James's remains from the various buyers. Robert Davidson was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for desecration of human remains, mail fraud, and racketeering. His funeral home was shuttered, its assets liquidated to pay damages to the 47 families whose loved ones had been sold during his 3-year criminal enterprise. The financial cost of the legal battle was enormous. Legal fees, investigator costs, travel expenses, and payments to buyers who returned James's ashes totaled over $120,000. But the personal cost was immeasurable in ways that had nothing to do with money. I learned that grief doesn't follow any predictable timeline, that betrayal can be more devastating than death, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that leave you financially poorer but spiritually stronger. The woman who had planned James's original memorial service would have been broken by this experience. The woman who emerged from it was someone I barely recognized but deeply respected. Today, 5 years later, James's recovered ashes rest in the mahogany urn I originally selected, displayed in our bedroom beside photos from our 22 years together. The memorial service we finally held 8 months after his death was smaller than originally planned, but filled with people who understood that love sometimes requires fighting impossible battles against overwhelming odds. Tyler returned to Northwestern and graduated with a degree in criminal justice, inspired by our legal battle to pursue a career in victim advocacy. Madison relocated back to Connecticut and now works with a nonprofit organization that lobbies for stronger funeral industry regulations. Helen and I have grown closer than we ever were when James was alive, bonded by shared determination to ensure his memory wasn't defined by the crime committed against his remains. The most unexpected outcome of this entire ordeal was the relationship I developed with Angela Morrison, the ceramic artist who had unknowingly purchased James's ashes. She closed her Portland studio and moved to Connecticut, where she now creates memorial pottery exclusively for families who commission her work directly. She's become not just a friend, but someone who understands the complex intersection of art, grief, and healing in ways that most people never will. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals teach you the most important lessons about your own strength, about the difference between justice and revenge, and about the power of refusing to let other people's evil choices define your story. Robert Davidson stole my husband's remains, but he couldn't steal my capacity to fight for what mattered most. I'm not the same woman who answered that phone call 5 years ago. I'm someone who learned that protecting the people you love sometimes requires becoming stronger than you ever thought possible. Someone who discovered that the most meaningful victories are often the hardest won, and someone who understands that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but rather choosing to build something better from the wreckage others leave behind. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning exactly 5 years after Robert Davidson first answered my phone call with lies about James's arrangements. It was from the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection, informing me that new legislation requiring crematory oversight and family notification protocols had passed unanimously in the state legislature. The James Coleman Memorial Act would prevent other families from experiencing what mine had endured. Reading that letter in the same dining room where I'd once planned memorial services with scattered photographs, I felt a sense of completion that had taken years to achieve. The fight to recover James's remains had evolved into something larger than personal justice. It had become a mission to protect other grieving families from predators who viewed death as a business opportunity. Madison called that evening with news that made the legislative victory even more meaningful. The nonprofit organization she worked for had received a federal grant to establish a nationwide database for tracking cremated remains, inspired directly by our case against Davidson and Sons. Tyler had been promoted to lead investigator in the Victim Advocacy Division of the Illinois Attorney General's office, specializing in funeral fraud cases that were becoming more common as oversight lagged behind industry changes. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in my own relationship with grief and memory. James's ashes now rested peacefully in our bedroom, but I'd learned that his true presence lived in the strength his love had given me to fight impossible battles, in the values he'd instilled in our children that drove them toward careers protecting others, and in the friendships forged through shared struggle that proved more lasting than the trauma that created them. Angela Morrison stopped by last weekend with a memorial piece she'd created for our anniversary. A simple ceramic candle holder inscribed with words James used to say when life got complicated. Do what's right, even when it's hard. She'd made it using clay from our backyard, mixed with nothing but her own artistic vision and the kind of respect for memory that Davidson had never understood. Standing in my garden that evening, lighting a candle in James's honor, I realized that the woman who had lost everything when Catherine rang her doorbell 5 years ago would barely recognize the person I'd become. Sometimes destruction leads to reconstruction on a foundation more solid than what came before. Sometimes fighting for what seems impossible teaches you that you're capable of far more than you ever imagined. The most important lesson from this experience isn't about trusting funeral directors or understanding legal documents, or even about the importance of asking difficult questions when something feels wrong. It's about discovering that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms into the courage to honor their memory by refusing to accept injustice, by protecting others from experiencing the same pain, and by building something meaningful from the pieces left behind. Robert Davidson took $800 for my husband's remains, but he gave me something infinitely more valuable in return. He showed me that I was stronger than any betrayal, more determined than any obstacle, and more capable of fighting for what mattered than I'd ever known. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for becoming the person you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.